thank you, Jaymie, for being part of Cemetery Park Online. It's all yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Jaymie. Obviously, I'll be doing the talk for you today. I'll give you like a little bit of background about me. So I've got an undergraduate degree in history, and I've just finished my MA in Folklore Studies. So I'm sort of merging the two together just to, help out the Cemetery Park a little bit with their online series. I want to thank everyone that has donated. It's been like really good to raise a bit of money for them as well, all the important work they're doing there. I'm going to put my Twitter handle on the chat, so if anyone does have any questions like days after, they can come and find me on there and I'll try my best to answer them. That's on there now. But I think, we'll just make a start. So I'm going to start with probably one of the most easily recognisable traditions that have long been associated with East London, and that will be the Pearly Kings and Queens. So the origins of the Pearlies can be traced back a very long time, and it is an identity that developed amongst London's costermongers, which is another name for a market or street trader. And so we have written evidence of them all the way back from the 1100s, but the most famous one would have been Henry Mayhew, who was writing in the mid-19th century, and he was looking at London labour and the London poor. It's quite a famous book. And he details how the costermonger, although very much working class and living in poverty, always pride themselves most of all upon their neckerchiefs and their boots, and especially the neckerchief, which was made of silk and called a kingsman. So costermongers would also sew buttons onto their trousers and jackets to decorate them, which we do have a picture of if Claire would like to share that. Oh, it's there. So you can see on the jacket, he's sewn the buttons onto it. And I think this is from about 1910, this photograph was taken. So the clothes hadn't really changed much in quite a long time. Bear with me. So pride in clothing was something that was taken really seriously by the poor in 19th century England, and there was no expectation to have brand new clothes. It was expected that you did look presentable and clean, which is something that is referred to as respectability, and that is still quite a notion that is like present within working class communities I'm from on myself, and it is sort of, as long as you look respectable, then it's fine. So I think it's probably this notion of respectability that is likely the cause of transition from costermonger to Pearly King or Queen. And that was first undertaken by an orphaned road sweeper by the name of Henry Croft, which is in the next picture. So you can see here, this is Henry Croft. Obviously the picture on the left-hand side is when he was alive, the one on the right-hand side is a memorial that was made for him a few years ago, and that is in St Pancras Cemetery. So according to the official website of the Pearly Kings and Queens of London, Henry came across 60,000 pearl buttons that had washed up on the banks of the Thames just by chance. He was just walking along one day and happened to see them there. But he had been really influenced by the charitable outlook of the Victorian costermongers, which he witnessed when he was growing up, as well as their flamboyant clothing editions. So he decided to emulate them, decorated the first ever pearly suit with the pearls that he found on the banks of the Thames with really intricate designs. And he also included statements such as all for charity and pity the poor. And I mean, there can't be any bigger sense of respectability than putting on like a bedazzled suit and doing charitable work. And I mean, the bedazzling of the suit is definitely a form of folk craft in itself. So that's like another tradition that you can look at from there. So the tradition then took off, and dedicated Pearly families would carry out charitable work, passing their traditions through generations, and many of them are very much still active. So there is an annual harvest festival, which is held still every year at London's Guildhall, and it's one of the most important events of the Pearly calendar. So I think that's on the next picture as well. You can see some from last year, I believe. Just a very lovely photo. So the interesting thing to note is that although people do really associate Pearly Kings and Queens just with East London, they can actually be found in almost every London borough. But I think it's probably the costermonger origins being working class people who lived in poverty, most likely in the Victorian East End, and the fact that East London was the biggest mass producer of mother of pearl buttons, which is why you have this strong Cockney association. So I mean, yeah, they still do like a lot of charity work. They are very good people, and they do kind of work like a royal family as well. So each family has like a king and a queen, and then that will pass down through the generations. It won't go to without the family. So they very much keep their titles. I mean, there are other traditions that are without a doubt definitely localised to the East End, and they are observed in very specific locations. So taking place every year at the Widow's Son pub in Bromley by Bow is a custom known as Bun Day. So that's on the next photo, if you could do that, Claire. Thank you. Oh, just pop that back in. Right, so yeah, the pub itself gets its name from being built on the site of an old cottage. The pub is called the Widow's Son, and that's associated with a local folk tale that details the sad story of a widow and her only son who was a sailor. So the story goes that in 1824, his son, upon leaving for sea, had asked his mum to bake him some hot cross buns in time for his return on Good Friday. And unfortunately, he never returned, but the widow, now being completely alone, continued to bake hot cross buns every year on Good Friday in hope that her son would one day come home. And she carried this tradition on every year until she died, with the buns only being discovered hanging from a beam within the cottage after they'd gone in to sort of clear the house, which is why the cottage became affectionately known by locals as the Bun House. And the pub which stands there today was built on the site of the cottage in 1848, and the tradition of hanging buns still continues there today. So every Good Friday, a new bun is added to the existing collection by a sailor in the Royal Navy, and sailors from around the country come and pay their respects through celebrations of singing and drinking and just having a very good time, which I think is lovely because it means that the widow, if she is still there, does get new visitors every year, doesn't have to sort of be so lonely. In more general folklore, hot cross buns do act as protective symbols and are usually associated with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So if anybody does want to attend Bun Day next year, and the world is a bit more normal by that point, it will go ahead on the 2nd of April at the Widow's Son in Bromley by Bow. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on the pub's website for updates nearer the time. So we've got just some more pictures of this. Is there another one? Oh no, this is the next bit, sorry. Okay, so there are obviously other events that can be found in the East End, and they encapsulate the sometimes quirky nature of its inhabitants, but also celebrate the strong community bonds that exist there. So in 1974, the first ever ferry festival was put on by the island communities of Silvertown and North Woolwich. And they're called island communities because they can cut themselves off theoretically by lifting the bridges up. And so it was created to bring the community together because obviously in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of factory closures and people were facing a lot of employment and uncertainty. And the festival acted as a way for the communities basically to give a message to the governments who had been neglecting the area by putting on this very big event that was described by people that were there as basically fun, organised mayhem. And the festival consisted of a super pub beer tent, a fun fair, fancy dress competitions, tugs of war, and anything else that you can think of really at a local sort of fair festival. But the most famous, like the most favoured event of the festival was definitely the Pram Race. So if you just flip to the next one, Claire. So you can see here we have a few people with their prams. So this was an adults only race, and it would be 2 people to a pram, which could be decorated in any way they liked, and it had to be decorated, with one person inside the pram and the other pushing it. So they had to be in fancy dress, and the race basically involved participants running around the local area on a very loosely specified route, and then stopping at each of the local pubs where they had to drink a pint. That was the mandatory part of the race. So those taking part were known to sort of carry flower bombs and eggs to throw at and sabotage their competitors. And there were prizes given out for the best dressed pram, the fastest pram, and the pram which came first. Though one person who wasn't local does recall being sabotaged at the finish line by an industrial strength hose in order to stop them from winning, which I'm sure was all in good jest, but no, you absolutely couldn't win if you weren't from within the community. But yeah, the Ferry Festival has remained an annual tradition for the people of Silvertown and North Woolwich, and that went into the 1980s, but it did cease to exist. But the local council in 2018 have revived it to celebrate the historical traditions of the area and to encourage those traditions like into the future. And I do think with the modern health and safety rules, you might find it a bit difficult to take part in a traditional 1970s pram race, but I'm sure there will be many other wonderful things to do at next year's festival. So if you just want to show the next picture, Claire, there's some pictures of the prams. This is one in the Batman costume, and then just the next one. So a bit of sabotage there as well. So I'm going to move on now to perhaps more sombre tradition that definitely highlights the community spirit that it does exist in the East End, and that is the Cockney funeral. So in quite a similar flamboyant fashion to the clothing modifications made by the costermongers, the Cockney funeral is all about cementing status, showing pride, even in the final physical journey of life. So in order to have a proper send-off, the Cockney funeral is a very extravagant affair, with the carriage pulled by horses that have to wear like feather plumes that is central to the tradition. The horses and carriages are usually black, however, white is sometimes used if the funeral is being held for a younger person. And flowers are also very important. So I mean, I know that I've attended Cockney funerals, and if you don't turn up with flowers, you are basically not welcome. And that is a way to show, I mean, not only a sign of condolence, but it's also sort of self-assertion that you've done the right thing by supplying this beautiful bouquet of flowers. And so even though the Cockney funeral, it is obviously a day of mourning, but it is used to celebrate life, and they tend to be quite joyous affairs. As the most famous sort of funeral provider would be T. Cribb and Sons, and they have been supplying Cockney funerals since 1881. And John Harris, who is a senior partner, he reveals that the East End has always been close. If you were born in the East End, you stayed and you died in the East End. And with that, you built up very much a community spirit. And community spirit is very prevalent in the Cockney funeral, where all members of a local community will be sure to turn out and pay their respects in what has been described as Victorian Music Hall meets Catholic High Mass. But what is interesting to note is how over the past sort of in recent history, the Cockney funeral has adapted to reflect the multicultural communities that we have in the East End now. And T. Cribb and Sons have branched out to incorporate like all manner of funerary services which reflect the needs of the local communities in East London. So for example, in their Beckton branch, they offer a washroom for Sikh and Hindu funerals. And at another branch where there is a strong Chinese community, and they make sure they adapt the routes home from the funeral to ward off evil spirits. They've also made mourning vaults available, so where offerings can be left for the dead. And they do have a special car where they will have like the lucky number 8 on the number plate for that. And the vault is quite interesting because there's actually been a steady rise in white British people adopting the mounted mourning vaults in East London, which does show a really interesting cross-cultural exchange of folklore. And T. Cribb and Sons have also been able to branch out as far as Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, due to their relationship with members of the local Ghanaian community in East London. You just want to flip the picture, Claire. So you can see here, this is a picture of a Ghanaian funeral. So I can tell you a bit about those now. So they do bear very striking resemblances between like the Cockney funeral and the Ghanaian funeral in terms of flamboyancy, where dancing pallbearers, DJs, and what's known as a fantasy coffin will be incorporated into the day. So I think we have, if you flip to the next photo, Claire. So this is one of the fantasy coffins. So they come in all manner of shapes. You just say what you want and they will provide it for you. And this has actually been taken off quite a lot in the UK as well, where you will have white British people again have adopted this tradition of having a fantasy coffin. If you just flip to the next one for me, Claire. And this is just a picture of the dancing pallbearers. I mean, they are similar in a way to the dress as well, because I know that in the East End, it's sort of expected that you'll wear black to the funeral. Ghanaian funerals, you wear red and black. It's just quite an interesting comparison there. But yeah, I mean, I think death obviously is an important event for anyone, no matter your religion or culture, no matter like how you view it as a sort of, you know, a transition or the end. But it really is interesting to see how folklore related to death can be shared, but also strengthen multicultural communities by providing services which do allow people to celebrate their cultural heritage through continuation of traditions and customs outside of their homeland. And I think it does probably enable people to open up discussions surrounding death as well, because you do have that cross-cultural communication where, you know, people are picking up these other traditions and like taking them on themselves. So back in the East End, there are clear examples of how migration to the area has shaped the folklore of East London. And it is one that probably is often overlooked as like folklore or tradition and custom, and that's food. So for me, like food is like steeped in folklore and can reveal so much about the traditions and customs of the area in which it's found and the people who are eating it. So we have folklore about food, as seen with the widow and the hot cross bun, but the preparation and eating of food can also be a folkloric practice. So I know that I definitely have my own tradition, which might seem a bit boring, but every Friday night I will get the same thing from the same takeaway at the same time, which is usually around 6 o'clock. I know my friend who is from Norway, she moved to the UK and still has a taco night every Friday, because that is a tradition in Norway. So you can kind of see, you know, the traditions that do come around food, and they are important to people. So yeah, if you look at food from a perspective of migration and folklore, the East End, and especially Brick Lane, is one where you can definitely see that. So Brick Lane has seen active immigration since the 17th century, with the 19th and 20th centuries seeing an increase in its Jewish population, and the late 20th century seeing like big arrivals from Bangladesh. And both communities have been central to the forming of the food law in the East End, introducing the famous Brick Lane bagels and the Brick Lane curry houses. So I'm sure that if you were to ask someone to name a type of food which represents East London, they probably will answer straight away with pie and mash, but they're also just as likely to say a Brick Lane curry or a salt beef bagel. The picture there. So I know that obviously the comparison between pie and mash and sort of the Brick Lane curry, they can't be more different in terms of, you know, flavour, taste and textures, things like that. But they do still represent the culinary soul of the East End. And it's really not uncommon now to find local East End pubs that will offer like a full Thai or Caribbean menu, which are authentic and usually very, very good. I mean, with food being central to traditions, like be it weddings, funerals and birthdays, they always act as a way for people to come together more generally, just over a shared meal. And this is something definitely reflected in East London, where you can celebrate multiculturalism through the vast array of food that's available at any given time. And it's really important to remember that traditions do change all of the time. And even pie and mash isn't what it used to be when it first became popular, because they actually used to be eel pies, but the Thames eel population was decimated from overfishing. So ground beef ended up being used in its place. So just because something hasn't always been there doesn't mean it can't be a tradition. You just want to flip through the pictures, Claire. There's just a few more of the food. So we've got the Brick Lane bagel here. This is one of the Thais that I went for in the Rusty Bike in Mile End. It's very good Thai food. Okay, so we're going to get on to dress now, and I'm sure that you will recognise these guys as hipsters, which I don't think there's anything wrong with. But just like food, I think clothing is often overlooked when thinking about traditions and customs. And with such a diverse community, East London does benefit from a really diverse fashion scene, which I think has been influenced by the traditional dress of local communities. And I don't mean that as to say that it's a direct influence where you have people appropriating traditional items of clothing from cultures they don't belong to. But there is definitely a sense of you can dress however you want in East London. And I do think that comes from the diversity that exists there. So the best way to see it is just to take a stroll through East London, and you'll probably see lots of things that you may not have seen before. So many of the shops and the market stalls offer really beautifully crafted items with traditional embroidery on them, which reflect the local Islamic community, as well as like bold, colourful prints, which reflect the local Ghanaian communities and the Jamaican communities. And you can really get a sense of the traditions that are embedded to sort of costume and dress, just if you go and take like a look around. So this sort of like feeling of freedom in the East End has been established by interactions between differing cultures and the community bonds that they share, which is shown by the shared folklore of the area. And I think it would be impossible to cite one type of folklore as the true definite representation of the East End. And I mean, like, to be honest, why would you want to when there is so much diversity to celebrate? So I think I always like to think about the soundscape of places as well when you visit them, because you can sort of get a lot from the traditions of the local people if you just listen out to see like what you can hear. So everyone knows that to be a true Cockney, you have to be born within earshot of the Bow Bells. But now with such a strong Islamic community in East London, we can also hear the adhan, which is the Muslim call to prayer. And this really does show how multiculturalism can enrich an area, and even in the most simplest of ways, where traditional song and music can create a kind of soundtrack to the locality, which really does reflect the people that are living there. So I think I've done that really quickly, but I'll end now by reading a snippet from a poem, which is entitled Shoreditch Serenade, and it's by Siddhartha Bose, and he is of Indian origin and resides in the UK now in London. But I think it really encompasses the diverse community of East London in a way. So it starts with, I hurled you into my arms, the cat in my voice a queen, you ever in reserve shied. Around us, East London took effect. A Pole, 2 Sicilians, married, 2 Greeks drinking Cobra beers, fang in hand, Emily the Scouse violinist, a German who thought Berlin too small. As we floated like bottle top, scrap paper, hay moss, towards the estuary where Bethnal Green meets Brick Lane. And there'll be some more pictures. Sorry, I missed that bit, Claire. It will just show you like the vibrancy of the marketplaces that we have. So this would be an Islamic dress shop, and you just got the market that shows sort of full array of all the colours and traditional dress that you can see there.
That was fantastic, Jaymie. Thank you very much.